Thank you so much, Carrie. Yeah. So wait, let's make sure this is the right way. There we go. Can you hear me, everyone? Okay, great. So good morning, all. Hanui Vit. I won't try to speak any more Nuktitut because Angus taught me and he might be here and I don't want to embarrass him. And my name is Neria Aylward. My family is from Gander and from St. John's. I grew up here in the city, and also in Toronto. And I'm starting the second year of my master's in development studies at Oxford in the UK. And I know it's early and I know we're all tired. So I'm gonna make you folks do the work for the first few minutes of this presentation. So sorry about that. Can we switch slides? Thanks. So this is the Ode to Labrador. If you're from Labrador, you probably know it. If you're not, maybe you don't. Especially for the latter group, I'd just like everyone to take a few seconds to sing through these verses in your head or out loud or whatever floats your boat to the tune of O Christmas Tree, which I'm not making up. And then I'm gonna ask you some leading questions about it. So just take about a few seconds, just read through it, familiarize yourselves. So basically what I just wanted to ask the people in the audience, so for people from Labrador, does this resonate with you? When did you first hear it? For people who aren't from Labrador, what does this make you think of? So can I have any volunteers? Anyone? Yes. Yeah. Of course. Yeah.
And our, I suppose people didn't hear me very well in the back. I'm an Inuit Bachelor of Education student, and in our governance class and some other classes, actually, we did critically analyze Ode to Labrador. As a child growing up, I heard this song and it just seemed normal at the time. So I was commenting that it was sort of part of our colonization in Labrador to think this is a good thing, that our resources should be looked at this way. So I just wanted to mention that we're aware of this, and of course it wasn't written by someone from Labrador. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else have anything they'd like to kind of point out? Well, okay, let's move on because we don't have that much time. But exactly that. And if we switch to the next slide, the first time I saw the Ode to Labrador as a Newfoundlander was when I went to do a tour of Churchill Falls, which I think is kind of telling, right? Sorry, I missed your name. To what Tracy was just saying. And if you compare it to the Ode to Newfoundland, right? In the Ode to Newfoundland, the country is still, it's wild, it's wilderness, but instead that makes us love it. And the winter is stern, but it's given the dignity of a proper name and agency of its own. And most importantly, perhaps, those of us who can sing this song with pride are cast as the natural heirs to this land, passed down to us through patriarchal bloodlines from God knows how long. And if you were just to read through these anthems, you would imagine two very different places. They're two vastly different myths. And this is precisely what my research is about. For my master's research, I'm critically examining the memoirs of settler public figures in Newfoundland, with a special focus on politicians. I want to understand how people with the platforms to shape public identity understand themselves and their place in the world. I've only just started my research, so this presentation is more about the thinking behind it. I do think, however, that this myth can be a useful lens to guide at least some of our discussion of politics and political economy in Newfoundland and Labrador in the age of Muskrat Falls. So what do myths have to do with political economy, if anything? And I would argue everything because my master's depends on it. But first, let's have a look at what political economy actually is. So this is how the Collins Dictionary defines political economy. It's the study of the way in which a government influences or organizes the nation's wealth. So this kind of comes from Adam Smith, who was writing The Wealth of Nations in 1776. It's this multi-volume treatise, for those of you who don't know, basically about how different countries end up with differing amounts of gold and silver, because with all their flaws, humans and institutions, especially governments, get involved with the functioning of the economy. So this is a really interesting insight, right? That wealth doesn't just generate itself, that people guide it. The economy doesn't run itself. And that's important. It can be a holistic way of examining the way that countries and their people do or don't make money in capitalist societies. And Smith would have called them commercial societies, but the point still stands. And it can teach us a lot about all the stupid mistakes, but also the bright ideas that governments and humans and institutions make that make their countries better or less well off. Can we just switch? Thank you. And this kind of analysis obviously has relevance for projects like Muskrat Falls. When you look at the conversation around Muskrat Falls, it's all pretty standard political economic analysis. So if we just look at the Muskrat Falls inquiry, just a little bit of it on the right-hand side here, the historical witness given by Jason Churchill just this week starts from 1949, from when Newfoundland, when it wasn't called Newfoundland and Labrador, became its own sovereign nation. And it talks about Muskrat Falls as a negotiation between Hydro-Québec and the government of Quebec, the government of Canada, and the Newfoundland and Labrador government, and the different entities that have represented that over the years. It's looking at the ways that different interests have competed over the years to influencing the harnessing of the kind that we saw in the Ode to Labrador of the Churchill River. Or if we look at this newspaper article that just came out yesterday that I screenshotted from my iPad, really professional. So Dwight Ball allegedly tears into Ches Crosby's in the PCs for what he calls the Great Muskrat Seduction, which is kind of funny because in his own memoir, Ches Crosby's father, John Crosby, squarely places the blame on Joey Smallwood and the Liberals for mismanaging the resource. A lot of political discourse surrounding Muskrat Falls has been politicians and bureaucrats pointing fingers at one another. Politicians, and that kind of speaks to the fact that politicians are often a lot more comfortable talking about one another than about a central assumption that underlies political economic analysis. Like the narrator of the Ode to Labrador, they all take for granted that the land belongs to them to begin with. It's a sovereign entity premised largely on ownership of land of the type that Adam Smith and many liberal political theorists envisioned and continue to envision today. So one thing that perpetually unsettles this comfortable conversation largely between old white guys is the persistence of Indigenous people who are surviving, thriving, and continuing to lay claim to their lands. It has taken Labradorians literally putting their body and safety on the line in protest to get politicians to listen up and include, however superficially, Indigenous voices in this conversation. And I just want to clear up any misunderstanding. I don't think that any of this is necessarily wrong. I don't think that Jason Churchill is wrong. I don't think that Dwight Ball is wrong, even though I don't agree with him. But I do think that our discourse is very limited. And it's only by virtue of the exceptional tenacity on the part largely of concerned Labradorians, but also just concerned citizens and journalists, that we've opened it up at all. So in this presentation, that's exactly what I want to talk about, how the political economy of Muskrat Falls is lacking a full reckoning with the legacy of empire and the shadows of ongoing colonialism. I'm going to talk about how Muskrat Falls and the settler political conversation around it is premised on entitlement to land that's not ours to begin with. So the research that I'm currently doing for my master's is about how settlers come to feel entitled to Labrador and continue to rationalize that ownership. And I'd just like to point out that this is by no means a groundbreaking idea. I think that for most people in this room, this is pretty old news. And for Indigenous people, it's an everyday lived experience. But for all kinds of reasons, this glaring insight has failed to make any lasting marks on the way that we talk about Muskrat Falls and about politics in Newfoundland and Labrador generally. I think that it's a responsibility on the part of settler scholars like myself to turn a critical lens on settler mythologies. So I want to make the point that a really critical examination of Muskrat Falls requires that settlers stop pointing fingers at one another just for a second and confront the racialized mythology of entitlement that keeps settlers in positions of power in this province in the first place. We need to, we need to ask ourselves how we even got to the point where the Muskrat Falls inquiry isn't entirely about colonialism and white supremacy. So can we switch slides? So settler myths start with settlement. And one story of settlement in Labrador is that of the British Empire. And thinking through the lens of colonialism reminds us that the political economy of Muskrat Falls is not just a local, provincial, or even national story. In the same year that the Ode to Labrador was written by an Oxford-educated Englishman who went to this place, which is down the road from where I go to school. It's funded by blood diamonds from Cecil Rhodes. Dr. Henry Labrador was given to Newfoundland by the Judicial Court of the Privy Council, which is the highest court in the British Empire. In order to decide that Labrador should belong to Newfoundland rather than to Canada, they drew on cases from the Gold Coast, in what we would now call Ghana, and the Coromandel Coast in India. Labrador was understood as a British colony, just like the other, in an empire on which the sun never set. What was at stake in this decision was control over resources, and more specifically, control over the Churchill River Basin. Since well before the PCs and the Liberals and Dwight Ball and Ches Crosby even existed, settlers were arguing over who got to dam the river, and it was never Indigenous people. And while empire dictates that Indigenous people, and here I mean Indigenous in the more kind of global generalist sense, were never given the chance to dam the river should they have ever wanted to by way of sovereignty, they also faced the greatest burdens of environmental destruction. This phenomenon is called environmental discrimination, which Taylor defines as follows in her excellent book, Toxic Communities. So environmental discrimination is the processes that result in minority and low-income communities facing disproportionate environmental harms and limited environmental benefits. In The Wrong Complexion for Protection, Bullard and Wright go on to write, environmental and public health threats from natural and human-made disasters are not randomly distributed. Healthy places and healthy people are highly correlated. It should be as no surprise that the poorest of the poor within the United States and around the world have the worst health and live in the most degraded and at-risk environments. And obviously, when you think about it, the burdens of mega projects like Muskrat Falls fall disproportionately on poor people and people of color. Think of the Kinder Morgan pipeline, hydro development in Manitoba, and Taylor's writing about African Americans in the US. Others have written about poor people in Appalachia in the US. But taking this broad view reminds us that it's not just about Ches Crosby and Dwight Ball or whoever's in power. It's about these bigger structures. But now we have to think about how that actually happens. And many people have argued that settler colonialism requires this exact relationship between settlers, Indigenous people, and land in order for the nation to exist. This has important implications for political economy, that environmental racism is a permanent relationship rather than some unfortunate accident. As Voiles writes in Wastelanding, Legacies of Uranium Mining in Navajo Country, settler colonialism is a distinct form of colonial power with a very particular relationship to resources and land. It's a form of colonial power that involves the settler making a home in a land that is already home to Indigenous people. To quote Deborah Bird Rose, Indigenous peoples got in the way of settler colonialism just by staying at home, because home is precisely what the settler colonial state seeks to occupy and remake. Remaking native land as a settler home involves the exploitation of environmental resources, to be sure, but it also involves a deeply complex construction that of land is either already belonging to the settler, his manifest destiny, or is undesirable, unproductive, or unappealing, in short, as the wasteland. Settler colonialism requires a twin myth, that Indigenous people are irrelevant and that their land is therefore free for the taking, or that their land is worthless and pollutable with leaked oil from pipelines or methylmercury from flooded debris. This corresponds really well with the experience that Lisa related yesterday in her address. In school, settler children in Newfoundland learned that Indigenous people in Newfoundland and Labrador are either extinct or that they can't govern themselves. In either case, settlers learn to inherit the land from a young age. This myth of unadulterated whiteness is the same one that I catch myself reproducing when I tell people at school that everyone in Newfoundland is white, despite the fact that my own mother, a woman visibly of color whose own mother immigrated from India, grew up her whole life in Gander. And so this myth perpetuates itself through residential schools and environmental violence and other forms of genocide, cultural or otherwise. As Frantz Fanon, a psychiatrist, philosopher, and revolutionary from the then French colony of Martinique, wrote, "The cause is the consequence. You are rich because you are white because you are rich." It is a double bind that allows the settler to inherit the earth, and as such allows political economy to make sense. Indeed, as Voiles continues, Native encounters with settler colonialism are so deeply entangled with environment and resources that even the phrase environmental racism can seem to lose all meaning in a tribal context. quite simply because racism has always meant environmental violence for Native people. Nationhood requires exclusion, and at its core, the settler colonial nation requires violence to survive. Violence against land, people, and all their relations. Newfoundland and Labrador was born on original sin, theft at best, genocide at worst. Political economy is well and good, but we need to start our analysis at least in 1492, when Columbus did or didn't sail the ocean blue, but never in 1949. 1949 is much too late, because although they may be its worthy heirs, it's presumptuous to think, even for a second, that the PCs or the Liberals invented colonial violence. As Valerie Kuletz writes in The Tainted Landscape, Environmental Ruin in the American West, about the dumping of nuclear waste on Indigenous land during the Cold War, once revealed, the nuclear landscape can be perceived and experienced differently. It can be seen as one landscape imposed upon another, a landscape of national sacrifice, as an expendable landscape, over which many North American Indians understand as a geography of the sacred, a geography where spiritual and cultural life are woven directly onto the landscape itself. What Valerie Kuletz says so succinctly is that the nation state requires sacrifice, and this sacrifice is often made under threat. Threats of climate change that only clean hydropower from Labrador can save us from. Threats to the dignity of Newfoundlanders who got played and embarrassed by Quebec in the Churchill Falls deal. It's easy to see these threats as politicized myths, but we have to remember that in the face of threat to the nation, someone has to make a sacrifice, and that sacrifice is often pushed onto Native people and their worthless land. That myths of Newfoundland pride, identity, or of energy security even, have other characters. There's nothing inherently just about a democracy because all nations are built on these myths, and the settler myth requires death of people, of cultures, of different stories and bodies to survive. And so I end with another quote by Feehan, which at the same time offers a seemingly insurmountable obstacle, but also a radical glimmering hope for a new kind of political economy. Decolonization, which sets out to change the order of the world, is obviously a program of complete disorder. Thank you.